Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we are going to start why Viking food was designed to never spoil, but before we get started make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. Medieval peasant houses should not have worked. By any modern standard, they look like a list of mistakes assembled out of desperation. Low ceilings, dirt floors, no insulation by contemporary definitions, no heating systems, no glass windows, no sense of comfort as we understand it. And yet, they survived winters that routinely killed people who underestimated them. Not occasionally. Repeatedly. For centuries. Medieval peasants lived in climates where winter was not an event. It was a condition. Cold did not arrive with drama and leave politely. It crept in early, stayed too long, and pressed on everything with quiet persistence. Snow piled up and stayed. Roads vanished. Work slowed or stopped entirely. Food became precious. Light became rare. And still, peasant homes did not collapse into frozen tombs. People lived. Children grew up. Elders reached old age. Meals were cooked. Tools were repaired. Life continued indoors while the outside world became hostile and indifferent. This wasn't luck. It wasn't toughness. It certainly wasn't comfort. It was design rooted in a single assumption that modern buildings often forget. Winter is not interested in your intentions. Medieval houses were not built to be pleasant. They were built to be survivable. That distinction explains everything that follows. The first thing medieval builders understood was that the ground was not the enemy. The air was. Cold air moves quickly. It changes its mind often. It steals heat aggressively and without apology. The ground, by contrast, is boring. Stable. Slow to react. Soil does not panic when temperatures drop. It holds on to warmth stubbornly and releases it reluctantly. So medieval homes sat low. Some were partially sunken. Others pressed close to the earth as if trying not to be noticed. Floors were often packed dirt, stone, or clay. Cold to the touch, yes, but also steady. A dirt floor does not suddenly become colder overnight the way exposed air does. It stays predictable. Modern people recoil at the idea of a dirt floor. Medieval peasants understood that predictability mattered more than comfort. You can work with cold that stays consistent. You cannot negotiate with cold that changes its mind every hour. Walls came next. And medieval walls were thick. Not elegant. Not symmetrical. Just thick enough to be inconvenient to winter. Timber frames filled with wattle and daub, mud, straw, clay, animal hair, whatever was available locally. These materials were not chosen because they were beautiful. They were chosen because they trapped air. Air is the real insulator. Medieval builders didn't talk about our values, but they understood that still air slowed heat loss. Mud and straw created pockets where air could sit quietly instead of moving. Moving air steals heat. Trapped air hoards it. Cracks were not disasters. They were patched with more mud. If a wall sagged, it was supported. If it leaked, it was sealed. Maintenance was constant but simple. No part of the house was precious. Everything was functional. From the outside, these homes looked temporary. From the inside, during winter, they felt solid. Roofs were low. Intentionally low. Heat rises. Medieval peasants knew this the way you know fire burns. High ceilings were wasted calories. Warm air drifting above head height was heat no one could use. So ceilings hovered close. Tall people learned to stoop. Children learned early. Warmth stayed where bodies were. Smoke lingered. Light stayed dim. But heat stayed inside. That trade was accepted without complaint. Roofing materials were heavy. Thatch, turf, wood, sometimes layered with soil. Snow accumulated and stayed. This was not seen as a failure. Snow acted as insulation. A roof buried in snow was a roof wearing a coat. Modern homeowners panic when snow doesn't slide off. Medieval peasants were relieved. It meant the house was sealed. Fire was central. Literally. The hearth sat in the middle of the home, not against a wall. Heat radiates outward more evenly when it begins at the center. Fire warmed people, walls, tools, and air simultaneously. The fire did not roar. It endured. Fuel was precious. Fires were banked at night, embers buried under ash so they could be revived in the morning without starting from nothing. Letting a fire go out in winter meant suffering. That lesson only needed to be learned once. Smoke filled the house. There were no chimneys in early homes. Smoke drifted upward and escaped slowly through roof vents or gaps. This sounds unpleasant, and it was. But smoke did work. It dried the structure. Wet wood rots. Dry wood lasts. Smoke preserved beams and rafters over time. It sealed cracks with soot. It discouraged insects. Fleas, lice, and other pests hated it. A smoky house was not clean by modern standards, but it was hostile to things that made life worse. People adapted. You learned where to sit. Where the air moved best. Where smoke gathered. Children grew up understanding airflow instinctively. Awareness replaced comfort. Space was limited. This was intentional. Empty space wastes heat. Medieval homes were crowded because bodies produce warmth. Families slept close together. Animals were sometimes brought indoors during the worst cold. Livestock generated heat. Smell was irrelevant. Survival was not. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Winter erased personal boundaries. You shared warmth whether you liked your neighbor or not. This closeness had another effect. Homes felt alive. Even during long winter nights, there was sound. Breathing. Movement. Fire crackling. Animals shifting. Silence was rare. Isolation rarer still. Modern homes are quiet and separate. Medieval homes were loud and shared. That noise was reassurance. It meant you were not alone against the cold. Windows were small. Sometimes non-existent. Glass was rare and expensive. Openings leaked heat. Light was less important than warmth. Darkness was accepted as part of winter life. You worked when you could see. You rested when you couldn't. Candles were used sparingly. Firelight cost fuel. Nothing was wasted on aesthetics. Medieval peasants did not romanticize hardship. They simply organized life around constraints. Work slowed in winter because it had to. Food was planned months in advance. Repairs were made constantly. Nothing waited until it broke completely. These homes worked not because they were strong, but because they were forgiving. They bent. They leaked slowly instead of failing suddenly. They absorbed mistakes instead of amplifying them. Modern homes are efficient when everything goes right. Medieval homes assumed everything would go wrong. That assumption made all the difference. Winter didn't defeat medieval peasants because winter was expected. Built for. Planned around. The house was not a refuge from reality. It was a tool designed to cooperate with it. And while modern houses may look better on the outside, there is something quietly impressive about a structure that can sit through months of cold, darkness, and scarcity and still keep people alive without asking for electricity, gas, or optimism. Medieval peasant houses were not warm. They were sufficient. And in winter, sufficient is everything. What made these houses truly effective was not any single clever feature, but the way every decision assumed scarcity. Heat was scarce. Light was scarce. Food was scarce. Energy was scarce. So nothing in the house wasted any of it. Even daily movement was shaped by cold. People did not wander aimlessly through rooms because there were no extra rooms to wander into. Movement stayed purposeful. You stood up to do something. You sat down to preserve warmth. Rest was not laziness, that it was fuel conservation. Clothing stayed on indoors. There was no sharp divide between inside and outside life. Wool, linen, fur, layers stayed wrapped around the body because removing them gained nothing. Heat loss was immediate and unforgiving. Medieval peasants understood that comfort did not come from removing hardship. It came from managing it. Sleeping arrangements reflected this. Beds were not isolated islands of privacy. They were shared platforms, raised slightly off the floor to avoid the coldest air. Straw mattresses trapped air just like walls did. Furs and blankets layered on top created microclimates around bodies. People slept close, not because they lacked imagination, but because distance cost warmth. Night was long. In winter, it felt endless. The house adapted by becoming quieter, slower, more inward. Conversation softened. Tools were repaired by firelight. Stories filled the darkness not for entertainment alone, but to mark time. When daylight disappears, you need something to measure the hours. The house helped with that. Its walls absorbed sound. Its low ceiling contained voices. The storm outside could scream all it wanted. Inside, everything felt muted, held, contained. This mattered more than we usually admit. A home that feels stable makes hardship tolerable. Medieval peasants did not expect winter to be pleasant. They expected it to be endured. Their homes reflected that expectation with quiet honesty. Food storage played a role too. Many homes had small attached storage areas or cellars dug into the ground. Again, the earth did the work. Root vegetables stayed cool but unfrozen. Grain stayed dry. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried and hung in the warmest parts of the house where the fire could protect it. Nothing about this was accidental. Food lived where heat was stable. People lived where heat was strongest. Animals lived where their warmth could be shared. The house was organized like a living system, not a static structure. Modern homes separate functions. Kitchen here. Bedroom there. Storage elsewhere. Medieval homes blended everything because separation wastes energy. Combining spaces meant sharing heat, attention, and effort. When repairs were needed, they happened immediately. A draft was not an inconvenience. It was a threat. A small leak could turn deadly if ignored. So maintenance was constant and communal. Someone always noticed when something changed. This constant awareness created resilience. Problems were solved when they were small. Nothing waited for permission or paperwork. The house evolved continuously, shaped by weather, use, and necessity. Even smell had a purpose. Smoke, animals, food, damp earth, all combined into an odor modern people would find unpleasant. Medieval peasants barely noticed it. Smell meant life was happening. Fire was burning. Food was cooking. Animals were alive. Silence and sterility were far more frightening. Winter forced people inward, not just physically but socially. The home became the center of existence. Outside work slowed or stopped. Inside tasks multiplied. Tools were sharpened. Nets were mended. Clothes were repaired. Hands stayed busy because stillness led to cold. The house supported this rhythm. Its warmth was uneven but predictable. You knew where it was warmest. You knew where cold crept in. You adjusted instinctively. Children learned this without instruction. They knew where to sit, where to sleep, when to move closer to the fire. Survival knowledge was not taught formally. It was absorbed through daily repetition. This is something modern design often forgets. People adapt faster than buildings do. Medieval homes worked with human behavior instead of trying to override it. When storms came, and they did, the house responded calmly. Wind battered walls that did not flinch. Snow piled up and stayed. The structure did not announce danger with loud noises or dramatic failures. It simply endured. That calm mattered. Panic wastes energy. A house that feels stable reduces fear. Fear burns calories. Medieval peasants could not afford to waste calories on anxiety. Even light behaved differently. Firelight flickered softly, absorbed by dark walls and smoke-stained beams. Shadows moved slowly. Nothing was harsh or bright. The house encouraged rest when work was done. Sleep came earlier. Waking came later. Life adjusted to the season instead of fighting it. Modern homes insist on consistency. Medieval homes accepted change. Winter life was different from summer life, and that was expected. Furniture moved closer to the hearth. Sleeping arrangements tightened. Animals came inside. Tools shifted position. The house was not a fixed object. It was a flexible response. Perhaps the most important feature of medieval peasant houses was humility. They did not attempt to dominate the environment. They did not stand tall and defiant against the weather. They crouched. They yielded. They worked around the cold instead of confronting it. This humility made them durable. Modern architecture often aims for control. Perfect temperature. Perfect lighting. Perfect separation. Medieval architecture aimed for balance. Enough warmth. Enough light. Enough safety. And enough was enough. That is why these houses survived winters that would shut down modern systems entirely. They did not rely on uninterrupted fuel delivery. They did not depend on complex mechanisms. They depended on gravity, mass, proximity, and habit. When something failed, it failed slowly. Slowly enough to be noticed. Slowly enough to be fixed. Winter did not defeat these homes because winter was expected to be cruel. The house was not surprised by it. And in that quiet preparedness, medieval peasants found something close to comfort. Not the comfort of softness or convenience, but the comfort of reliability. The kind of comfort that lets you sleep while the storm howls outside, knowing the walls will still be there in the morning. And for people who lived where winter ruled the calendar, that was more than enough. Over time, this reliability shaped how people thought. When your house does not betray you in winter, you stop treating survival as a daily emergency and start treating it as a routine. That mental shift mattered more than we usually acknowledge. Panic fades. Planning replaces fear. The home becomes a steady background presence rather than a constant worry. Medieval peasants did not wake up each morning wondering if their house would still function. They assumed it would. That assumption freed attention for other things: food management, repairs, animal care, social bonds. Stability creates bandwidth. Even a small amount of it changes everything. The materials themselves reinforced this calm. Wood creaked, yes, but slowly. Earth settled with patience. Thatch compressed under snow without complaint. Nothing snapped suddenly. Nothing failed dramatically. Sounds were gradual, familiar, expected. You learned the language of the house the way sailors learn the sound of their ship. A new noise meant something needed attention. An old noise meant things were as they should be. This relationship between people and their homes was intimate. Not sentimental. Practical. You knew where heat leaked. You knew which wall felt colder in a north wind. You knew which beam held the most weight. The house was not an object you owned. It was a system you participated in. That participation mattered in winter, when even small mistakes carried consequences. Leave a door open too long and the room cooled noticeably. Forget to bank the fire and the morning punished you. Fail to patch a gap and the wind found it immediately. Feedback was fast and unforgiving, which made learning unavoidable. Modern homes insulate us not just from weather, but from consequences. Medieval homes did not. They taught constantly. Even waste was managed with intent. Ash from the fire was saved, reused for cleaning, soil treatment, or insulation. Nothing warm was thrown away thoughtlessly. Warmth was a resource like food or water. You handled it carefully. Time itself slowed in winter. Without reliable artificial light, evenings lengthened. Work became quieter. The house encouraged this rhythm. Low light reduced unnecessary movement. Smoke softened edges. Shadows blurred details. The environment gently pushed people toward rest. This was not laziness. It was efficiency. Bodies recovering conserved energy. Muscles repaired. Illness was less likely to take hold in exhausted people. Rest was a survival strategy. Children absorbed this rhythm without instruction. Winter meant fewer errands, more indoor tasks, more listening than doing. Elders became repositories of knowledge because storytelling fit the season. Memory mattered when movement didn't. The house supported all of it by being predictably boring. Nothing flashy. Nothing surprising. Just steady containment. Even during extreme cold, the interior temperature did not swing wildly. It hovered. Not warm enough to forget winter existed. Not cold enough to cause harm. That narrow band of good enough is difficult to achieve even with modern technology. It was achieved here with mass, patience, and acceptance. When spring came, the house changed again. Animals moved out. Doors stayed open longer. Smoke thinned. Light returned. The same structure adapted without renovation or redesign. It simply responded to new conditions. This adaptability is easy to miss because it looks passive. But it was intentional. Medieval peasants did not build season-specific houses. They built houses that tolerated change. Modern design often optimizes for a narrow range of conditions. Medieval design optimized for variability. That made it robust. There is a temptation to romanticize this way of living, to imagine a cozy simplicity that ignores discomfort. That would be dishonest. Life in these homes was hard. Cold was always present. Smoke irritated eyes. Space was tight. Smells lingered. Privacy barely existed. But hardship does not automatically mean fragility. In many ways, it produced the opposite. Because expectations were realistic, disappointment was rare. Because systems were simple, failure was manageable. Because everyone understood the limits, no one relied on miracles. Winter came. The house responded. People adapted. That loop repeated year after year until it became ordinary. And that ordinariness is the most impressive part. These homes did not succeed because they were extraordinary. They succeeded because they were ordinary in the most disciplined way possible. They did the same small things correctly, over and over, without demanding perfection. Modern homes often aim to eliminate discomfort entirely. Medieval homes aim to keep discomfort within survivable bounds. One goal is fragile. The other is resilient. When storms cut off travel and snow buried the landscape, the house did not care. It was already prepared to exist in isolation. Food was stored. Heat was contained. People were together. Isolation was not a crisis. It was expected. That expectation shaped culture, behavior, and architecture into a single quiet agreement with reality. Winter would come. Winter would stay. The house would hold. And because it did, generations lived, worked, aged, and died without ever considering their homes remarkable. They were just there. Doing their job. Which may be the highest compliment a house can receive. If you listen closely to stories like these, the lesson is not about mud walls or low ceilings or smoky fires. It's about designing life around what will definitely happen, rather than what we hope will not. Medieval peasants did not hope winter would be mild. They assumed it would be harsh. And by doing so, they quietly removed its power to surprise them. That is why their homes endured. And why, long after the people are gone, the logic behind those homes still feels unsettlingly sound, and when you sit with that idea long enough, something subtle happens. You begin to notice how little of this depended on intelligence in the modern sense. No calculations. No measurements beyond what the body could feel. No abstract planning divorced from experience. Everything was learned through repetition, correction, and memory. A wall was thick because a thinner one failed last winter. A roof was low because heat escaped when it was higher. A fire sat in the center because corners stayed cold. Nothing was theoretical. Everything was tested. This meant knowledge did not live in books or specialists. It lived in habits. In hands that patched the same place every year. In eyes that noticed frost forming where it shouldn't. In feet that knew which part of the floor stayed warmest at night. The house taught constantly, and everyone listened because the lessons were unavoidable. There was no illusion that comfort could be permanent. Comfort was seasonal, temporary, conditional. In summer, the house felt cool and shaded. In winter, it felt enclosed and restrained. No one expected it to feel the same all year. Expectation matched reality, and that alignment reduced frustration. Frustration, like fear, wastes energy. Even social behavior shifted in winter. Arguments still happened, of course, but prolonged conflict was impractical. Holding grudges costs warmth. Cooperation wasn't moral virtue. It was thermal efficiency. The house reinforced this by forcing proximity. You could not storm off into another room that didn't exist. You could not isolate yourself without consequence. Distance meant cold. Closeness meant survival. That doesn't mean life was harmonious. It means disagreement was contained. Just like smoke. Just like heat. Just like everything else. Containment is a recurring theme here. Medieval peasant houses did not eliminate problems. They contained them within tolerable limits. Smoke stayed, but not enough to suffocate. Cold entered, but not enough to kill. Crowding annoyed, but did not isolate. Everything hovered just below crisis. This balance required constant attention, but not constant anxiety. Once the system was understood, it ran quietly in the background. Like breathing. You only noticed it when something went wrong. Even illness was managed this way. A sick person stayed near the fire. Warmth supported recovery. Others adjusted their work. Life slowed. The house did not provide medicine, but it provided stability, which mattered just as much. The same was true for aging. Elders were not pushed aside. Their reduced mobility fit winter life naturally. They stayed near the hearth. They watched. They advised. They remembered. The house made space for them by not demanding speed or distance. This is another thing modern design often overlooks. A space that works for the strongest person only works temporarily. A space that works for the slowest lasts generations. Medieval peasant houses were built for decline as much as for strength. They assumed bodies would tire, stiffen, weaken. And they adapted to that reality quietly, without drama. Doors were low. Steps were few. Distances were short. Everything was reachable without unnecessary movement. Efficiency was not about speed. It was about effort. When storms cut off villages from the outside world, there was no expectation of rescue. None was coming. That knowledge shaped behavior long before the snow fell. People prepared because preparation was normal, not heroic. The house embodied that mindset. It did not promise safety from everything. It promised resistance long enough to matter. And in most winters, that was enough. There is something deeply modern about our discomfort with this idea. We want guarantees. We want certainty. We want systems that never fail. Medieval peasants accepted that failure was inevitable and focused instead on making it slow, visible, and survivable. That approach produces structures that age well. If a beam weakened, it sagged before it broke. If a roof leaked, it dripped before it collapsed. If a wall cooled, it warmed before it froze. Signals came early. Response was possible. Winter was not defeated. It was negotiated with, day after day, through small, unremarkable choices that added up to survival. And perhaps that is why these houses feel so different from modern ones. Not in appearance, but in attitude. They do not promise comfort. They promise continuity. They say, you can live here, as long as you pay attention. As long as you accept limits. As long as you adapt. As long as you do not expect the world to soften for you. That message is not loud. It doesn't sell well. But it works. And it worked long enough for millions of ordinary people to live ordinary lives in conditions that, by modern logic, should have crushed them. Which leaves us with a quiet, uncomfortable question. If homes built from mud, straw, wood, and smoke could endure centuries of winter with no external support, what, exactly, are our own houses built to survive? And just as quietly, the medieval house offers an answer it has been giving all along. Not everything, and sitting with that idea a little longer, it becomes clear that just enough was never a compromise. It was a philosophy. One that shaped not only buildings, but expectations, habits, and even patience itself. Medieval peasants did not wait for ideal conditions. They worked within the conditions they had. The house reflected this mindset by never pretending to be more than it was. It did not promise luxury tomorrow if you endured discomfort today. It offered steadiness now, in exchange for attention and care. That exchange built trust. You trusted the house because you understood it. You understood it because you helped maintain it. That loop created a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with participation. Modern homes often feel opaque. Systems are hidden. Controls are abstract. When something fails, it feels sudden and inexplicable. Medieval homes were transparent. You could see the fire. You could feel the walls. You could hear the roof under snow. Nothing was mysterious. Mystery breeds anxiety. Familiarity breeds calm. This calm mattered deeply during long winters when daylight vanished and time stretched. When weeks blurred together, the house provided markers. The fire needed tending. Ash needed clearing. Roofs needed checking after storms. These small tasks anchored time. Days did not dissolve completely because the house required engagement. Engagement kept minds occupied. Idleness in winter was not rest. It was rumination. The house prevented that by always offering something small to do, something necessary but manageable. Even boredom served a purpose. Without constant stimulation, thoughts slowed. Worries lost momentum. The pace of life matched the pace of the season. Winter asked for patience, and the house enforced it gently. This is not to say that people were content in some romantic sense. Discontent existed. So did fatigue. But despair requires a sense of helplessness, and these homes quietly removed that. You were never entirely helpless. There was always a task. A patch. A fire to tend. A neighbor within reach. Isolation, one of winter's sharpest weapons, was blunted by design. The house also made scarcity visible. Food stores were not hidden behind walls. You saw them shrink. You adjusted accordingly. Waste felt personal because consequences were immediate. This visibility encouraged restraint without requiring discipline in the modern sense. The environment did the teaching. Heat worked the same way. If you wasted it, you felt it. If you conserved it, you benefited quickly. Feedback was honest. Over time, This honesty shaped behavior into something resembling wisdom. Not wisdom from reflection, but from repetition. From seeing the same cause and effect play out year after year. That is why these homes did not need instruction manuals. The structure itself taught you how to live within it. And when something truly went wrong, an illness, a failed harvest, an especially brutal winter, the house did not solve the problem. But it reduced the number of problems you had to face at once. It narrowed your focus to the immediate and the manageable. That narrowing is important. Crisis overwhelms when everything demands attention simultaneously. Medieval homes limited the number of decisions you had to make. Heat was here. Food was there. People were close. The world outside could wait. In that sense, the house acted like a filter. It let in only what could be dealt with. Modern life often lacks this filter. Information, demands, noise, and urgency pour in unchecked. Medieval homes were quiet not because life was simple, but because complexity was kept outside. The thick walls that stopped wind also stopped distraction. This created a strange kind of mental space. Even crowded, even smoky, even cold, the interior felt contained. Thoughts did not scatter as easily. Attention stayed local. It's difficult to measure this, but it mattered. Mental endurance is as important as physical endurance during long periods of hardship. The house supported both. As centuries passed, techniques improved. Chimneys were added. Windows grew slightly larger. Materials changed. But the underlying logic stayed the same. Expect winter to be harsh. Design for that reality. Accept trade-offs without resentment. When people forgot that logic, houses failed. When they remembered it, houses endured. And perhaps that is why these structures still feel instructive rather than obsolete. Not because we should copy them directly, but because they remind us of a way of thinking that values sufficiency over excess. They remind us that resilience is not about strength alone. It is about forgiveness. About systems that allow for error, fatigue, and change without immediate collapse. Medieval peasant houses forgave their occupants constantly. You could be tired. You could be sick. You could make small mistakes. The house would absorb them quietly. That forgiveness is rare in modern systems. And its absence is felt most strongly when conditions turn hostile. Winter reveals priorities. It strips away what is unnecessary and tests what remains. Medieval homes passed that test not by being impressive, but by being honest. They did not ask winter to be kind. They simply prepared for it not to be. And in doing so, they created spaces where ordinary lives could continue, unremarkable and resilient, through months that would otherwise feel unbearable. Not because winter became gentler, but because the house made it smaller. And once winter was made smaller, something unexpected happened. People stopped measuring life against it. Cold became a background condition rather than a constant opponent. You didn't wake each day asking if winter would win. You woke asking what needed doing inside the space that already held. That shift changes how time feels. Instead of counting down to spring with impatience, people settled into the season. Winter became its own mode of living, with its own pace and rules. The house supported that by remaining consistent even as the world outside grew unstable. Consistency is underrated. When nothing else is reliable, a space that behaves the same way every day becomes an anchor. Medieval peasant houses were anchors. They did not surprise you with sudden failures or dramatic changes. They aged slowly, predictably, almost apologetically. This predictability extended to sound. Wind outside could roar, but inside it arrived as a dull pressure against walls. Snow fell silently. Ice cracked distantly. The house filtered the violence of weather into something manageable. You heard winter, but it no longer shouted directly at you. That filtering mattered, especially at night. Darkness amplifies fear when combined with unfamiliar noises. Medieval homes softened both. Low light and muffled sound made nights long, but not threatening. The house became a cocoon where the outside world felt far away, even when it was only a wall's thickness removed. People slept more deeply than we might expect, not because they were comfortable, but because vigilance was reduced. You did not need to watch the weather constantly. The house did that for you. If something changed, you would feel it. Feeling replaced monitoring. Touch replaced measurement. Smell replaced instrumentation. The house communicated through the senses, and people listened because they had to. This sensory awareness created a kind of attentiveness that modern life rarely demands. You notice temperature shifts immediately. You noticed drafts before they became problems. You noticed fatigue in yourself and others and adjusted accordingly. Nothing encouraged excess. Excess meant waste. Waste meant vulnerability. Even celebrations adapted to winter logic. Gatherings happened close to the hearth. Food was shared communally. Light was concentrated in one place rather than spread thinly. Joy existed, but it was focused. Contained warmth, both literal and social. The house shaped this by limiting options. You could not scatter attention across multiple rooms or distractions. Presence was unavoidable. This could be uncomfortable, but it also built familiarity. People learned each other's rhythms, moods, and limits. That familiarity reduced conflict over time. Not because people became kinder, but because predictability makes friction easier to manage. You knew who needed quiet. Who needed warmth. Who needed to move. The house enforced these negotiations gently but firmly. In this way, architecture became a form of social regulation. Not through rules, but through constraints. Constraints made cooperation the easiest option. When spring eventually arrived, it felt earned. Doors opened. Smoke thinned. Space expanded outward. But the memory of winter lingered. The house carried it in darkened beams and soot-stained walls. A reminder of what it had done. And when the next winter came, there was no shock. No disbelief. No scrambling. The house was already shaped by the last one. Experience had been built directly into its structure. This is something modern buildings struggle to do. They are often reset each season, insulated from memory by systems that promise uniformity. Medieval houses remembered. They accumulated knowledge in their very fabric. Each repair told a story. Each thickened wall marked a past failure corrected. Each low beam reflected a lesson learned the hard way. The house became a record of adaptation. Living inside such a record changes how you see hardship. Difficulty stops feeling random. It becomes contextual. Understandable. Manageable. Winter was not an enemy anymore. It was a known quantity. And that knowledge created a quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Not defiance. Just the assurance that whatever came, there was a way to exist through it. That confidence did not come from strength alone. It came from alignment. The house aligned with the season. People aligned with the house. Everything moved in the same direction. When alignment exists, resistance drops. Energy is conserved. Life continues. This is perhaps the most enduring lesson these homes offer. Not about materials or layout, but about mindset. Design your life around what will happen, not what you wish would. Medieval peasant houses did exactly that. And in doing so, they turned some of the harshest winters imaginable into something survivable, ordinary, and eventually forgettable. Which, in its own quiet way, is a remarkable achievement, and when winters become forgettable, they lose their power to dominate memory. They stop defining life and start framing it instead. Medieval peasants remembered seasons, not disasters. The house made that possible by absorbing the worst of each winter and leaving behind only manageable traces. Those traces showed up in subtle ways. Slightly darker beams from years of smoke. Floor hollows worn by the same paths walked every day. Walls thickened by countless small repairs. None of this was planned as legacy. It happened because maintenance was constant and humble. Nothing was replaced all at once. Pieces were adjusted. Reinforced. Patched. The house aged the way bodies do, gradually, visibly, honestly. This made change less frightening. Aging wasn't failure. It was evidence of survival. That attitude extended to tools and furniture. Stools were simple, easy to move closer to heat. Tables were sturdy, not decorative. Everything could be repositioned depending on the season, the weather, or who needed warmth most. Flexibility mattered more than elegance. Even sleeping arrangements shifted subtly through winter. People migrated closer to the hearth as cold deepened. Children and elders occupied the warmest spots. This wasn't negotiated formally. It was understood. The house made the hierarchy of warmth obvious. Warmth, like food, followed need rather than status. This practical fairness reduced resentment. Inequity is harder to tolerate when survival is at stake. The house, by making conditions visible, discouraged unnecessary competition. There was little point in hoarding heat. Excess warmth could not be hidden. Modern environments often hide inequality behind walls and systems. Medieval homes exposed it. Exposure encouraged balance, if only because imbalance was dangerous. The house also limited choice in helpful ways. You couldn't overcomplicate life when options were few. Meals were repetitive but reliable. Days followed familiar patterns. This repetition freed mental energy for endurance rather than novelty. Novelty is expensive. It requires resources, attention, and tolerance for failure. Winter was not the season for novelty. The house enforced that wisdom without argument. Even entertainment reflected this. Stories were repeated. Songs were familiar. The same tales were told each year, not because imagination was lacking, but because familiarity soothed. You didn't need surprise to feel engaged. You needed reassurance. Reassurance came from knowing what happened next. The house provided that knowledge structurally. The fire would need tending. The roof would hold. The walls would stand. Tomorrow would resemble today, and today was survivable. This predictability created space for subtle joys. Shared meals. Warm hands near embers. Laughter muffled by smoke. These moments didn't stand out as highlights. They blended into life quietly. But quiet does not mean insignificant. It means sustainable. Sustainability is not glamorous. It does not announce itself. It simply persists. Medieval peasant houses persisted because they did not chase improvement endlessly. They sought adequacy and stopped there. Once something worked, it stayed. Change happened only when necessity demanded it. That restraint protected against overreach. Overreach is fragile. Adequacy is resilient. When famine or disease struck, the house could not prevent suffering. But it reduced chaos. It provided a place where care could happen. Where rest was possible. Where grief was shared rather than isolated. Shared grief, like shared warmth, is easier to bear. This sharing was not sentimental. It was structural. The house made isolation difficult. It insisted on presence. Even in sorrow, people were not alone. Winter magnifies loneliness. Medieval houses countered that by design. As centuries passed and societies changed, many of these principles were abandoned in favor of speed, scale, and separation. But the logic remains quietly intact. It waits beneath modern layers of complexity, reminding us that endurance comes from alignment, not domination. Medieval peasants did not conquer winter. They arranged their lives so winter could not easily conquer them. Their houses were the physical expression of that arrangement. And long after the fires have gone cold and the walls have returned to earth, the idea still lingers, quiet, patient, and stubbornly practical. Build for what will happen. Accept limits without resentment. Make hardship smaller, not louder. That was the unspoken contract between medieval peasants and their homes. And it worked. What's striking is how little of this depended on individual toughness. Survival wasn't a personal achievement, it was a collective condition. The house didn't care who you were on your best day. It was built for everyone's worst days. That distinction matters. Modern stories of resilience often focus on heroic effort. Medieval life rarely allowed that fantasy. Exhaustion was normal. Illness was common. Strength fluctuated. So the environment compensated where people could not. Floors were dirt not because of ignorance, but because dirt is forgiving. It absorbs spills. It insulates slightly. It can be repaired with what's already there. Stone was used where permanence mattered. Wood where flexibility mattered. Nothing was chosen at random. Even smoke, which we now see as a flaw, served a purpose. It preserved beams, deterred insects, and slowed rot. The discomfort was accepted because the benefit was real. The house was not optimized for comfort alone, it was optimized for continuity. Continuity was the real luxury. Generations lived under the same roof. Not always at the same time, but in sequence. Children grew up inside the same walls their grandparents had repaired. Memory was embedded in space. You learned where the roof leaked because someone before you had learned it first. This reduced the learning curve of survival. Knowledge didn't reset with each generation. It accumulated. That accumulation made life slightly easier over time, even when conditions didn't improve. Improvement wasn't the goal. Stability was. Stability allowed people to plan just far enough ahead. Not decades, but seasons. Planning beyond that was dangerous. Too many unknowns. Too many variables outside human control. The house anchored planning to what could be managed. It narrowed the future into something approachable. This approach shaped emotional expectations as well. Hope was modest. Despair was tempered. Extremes were smoothed out by routine. When you expect difficulty, difficulty is less shocking. When you don't expect miracles, their absence doesn't break you. That emotional moderation was a survival tool. Winter tested it constantly. Long nights. Limited food. Repetitive days. The house countered monotony not with variety, but with rhythm. The fire needed tending at regular intervals. Meals happened at predictable times. Sleep followed darkness. Your body aligned with the season because the house enforced alignment. Artificial light now allows us to ignore cycles. Medieval houses did not. They reminded you, gently but persistently, that rest was not optional. Darkness meant stillness. Activity had limits. Limits protected people from themselves. Overwork was possible, but unsustainable. The environment pushed back. Cold stiffened fingers. Darkness shortened workdays. Hunger slowed movement. The house absorbed these pressures and translated them into pauses. Pauses are where recovery happens. Recovery wasn't framed as self-care. It was simply what happened when nothing else could be done. You sat. You warmed your hands. You listened. You waited. Waiting is uncomfortable in modern life because it feels unproductive. In medieval winter, waiting was productive. It conserved energy. It prevented mistakes. It allowed conditions to change. The house made waiting tolerable. Walls blocked wind. Fire softened cold. Familiar spaces reduced anxiety. Even boredom had a texture that could be endured. Endurance is often just boredom without panic. This is why winter didn't break communities as often as we might expect. It exhausted them, yes. It thinned them, sometimes brutally. But it didn't constantly destabilize them. The house provided a stable frame inside which hardship unfolded slowly enough to be processed. Slow hardship is survivable. Sudden hardship is not. When storms came, they were heard before they arrived. When snow fell heavily, it accumulated visibly. When cold deepened, it did so gradually. The house translated external extremes into internal gradients. That translation saved lives. Modern infrastructure does something similar but hides the process. Medieval houses made it visible. You learned cause and effect intimately. You understood why things failed because you felt the failure developing. This understanding bred respect for limits. You didn't curse winter endlessly. You adapted around it. Anger wastes energy. Acceptance conserves it. Acceptance did not mean passivity. It meant choosing battles carefully. You fought rot. You fought leaks. You fought hunger. You did not fight the season itself. The house was your ally in that strategy. And allies matter more than weapons. By the time spring arrived, people were thinner, slower, and tired, but intact. The house stood with them, scarred but functional. Another cycle completed. Another winter absorbed. Life continued not because it was easy, but because it was structured to continue. That is the quiet brilliance of medieval peasant houses. They did not promise safety. They promised survivability. And for centuries, that promise was enough. And survivability shaped how people judged success. A good year wasn't one of abundance or comfort. It was a year where nothing collapsed. Where roofs held. Where fires stayed lit. Where people made it through without catastrophe. That bar was intentionally low, and that's why it was reachable. The house calibrated expectations downward in a way that protected morale. When your environment assumes hardship, endurance feels normal rather than heroic. You didn't feel like you were constantly failing. You felt like you were participating in a difficult but familiar process. Familiarity reduces fear more effectively than optimism ever could. Children grew up inside this logic. Winter wasn't framed as something to dread, it was something to prepare for. Preparation was visible everywhere. Stored grain. Bundled tools. Thicker bedding pulled closer to the hearth. The house taught anticipation without anxiety. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. Anxiety imagines endless worst cases. Anticipation imagines specific, manageable ones. Medieval houses supported anticipation by making needs concrete and limited. You knew how much wood you had. You knew where heat reached and where it didn't. You knew which walls leaked cold and which didn't. There were no hidden variables pretending to be stable. Transparency builds trust. Trust wasn't placed in authorities or systems far away. It was placed in materials you could touch. Wood. Stone. Clay. Thatch. If something failed, you could see why. You could often fix it yourself or with help nearby. That agency mattered. Feeling helpless drains energy faster than cold ever could. The house preserved agency by remaining understandable. No mysteries. No sealed mechanisms. No invisible dependencies. Understanding breeds calm, even in difficult conditions. Calm allowed people to respond rather than react. When food ran low, portions shrank evenly. When sickness spread, movement slowed. When storms trapped families indoors, days blurred together without panic. The house made containment possible. Physical containment supported emotional containment. Chaos stayed outside more often than not. This containment also shaped memory. People remembered winters as long, tiring stretches, not as constant emergencies. The difference matters. Emergencies demand adrenaline. Long stretches demand patience. Patience was the real survival skill. Patience with cold fingers. With smoky air. With repetitive meals. With each other. The house rewarded patience by remaining stable. Impatience, reckless changes, unnecessary expansion, wasted resources, was punished quickly. So behavior adapted. Over time, this produced communities that valued steadiness over speed. Reliability over novelty. Endurance over display. These values weren't moral ideals, they were practical conclusions drawn from living inside constrained spaces for months at a time. The house didn't preach these values. It enforced them quietly. Even conflict followed this logic. Arguments happened, but escalation was limited. There was nowhere to storm off to without consequences. Silence had weight. Reconciliation often followed simply because coexistence was unavoidable. The house compressed social distance the same way it compressed heat. Compression can be uncomfortable, but it also reduces fragmentation. People learned how to share space because they had no alternative. That skill carried into work, caregiving, and survival decisions. Modern life often assumes infinite space, physical, emotional, digital. Medieval winter assumed none of that. The house was finite. Resources were finite. Energy was finite. Finiteness clarifies priorities. You stopped asking what you wanted and focused on what was necessary. That focus stripped life down to essentials. Warmth. Food. Rest. Company. Everything else faded. This stripping down can feel bleak when imagined from the outside. But from within, it often felt grounding. Noise fell away. Distraction vanished. Life narrowed, but it also deepened. Depth replaces breadth when conditions demand it. That depth showed up in attention. People noticed small changes. The sound of wind shifting. The smell of damp wood. The tone of a cough. These details mattered. Awareness sharpened because ignorance was costly. The house trained awareness by making feedback immediate. A draft was felt instantly. A failing fire cooled the room quickly. Nothing waited politely. This responsiveness built competence. People trusted their senses. They trusted experience. They trusted the slow accumulation of knowledge. By the end of winter, exhaustion was real, but so was confidence. Not confidence in conquering the future, but confidence in navigating it. The house stood as proof that navigation was possible. Year after year, season after season, that proof was renewed. Walls endured. Fires burned. People adapted. Life continued. And in that continuation lies the real lesson: survival isn't about winning against harsh conditions. It's about designing life so harshness has less leverage. Medieval peasant houses were not masterpieces of comfort or beauty. They were masterpieces of leverage reduction. They took something overwhelming, winter, and made it smaller, slower, and survivable. That is not dramatic. That is not heroic. But it is how most humans have lived, endured, and passed life forward. Quietly. Patiently. One winter at a time. And when you look closely, that quiet patience wasn't passive at all. It was active restraint. Choosing not to fight reality head-on takes more discipline than constant struggle. Medieval peasants practiced that discipline daily, guided less by philosophy and more by walls, fire, and fatigue. The house rewarded those who listened. If you tried to rush winter, to burn fuel too fast, to work past daylight, to ignore signs of weakness, the house pushed back. Rooms grew colder. Smoke thickened. Bodies faltered. Consequences arrived quickly, not cruelly, but clearly. Clear consequences simplify decision-making. You didn't need abstract rules. You needed attention. Attention became a habit. Not the anxious kind, but the steady, observational kind. You noticed how long embers lasted overnight. You noticed which logs burned slowest. You noticed how many people could sit near the hearth before warmth diluted. These details shaped behavior more effectively than any instruction ever could. Knowledge was local and embodied. It lived in hands and muscles, not books. The house was the classroom, and winter was the curriculum. Mistakes were costly, but they were also instructive. A frozen water vessel taught timing. A cracked beam taught load limits. A draft taught orientation. Each lesson was absorbed into routine and rarely repeated. This is how wisdom accumulates without formal systems. Because the house remained mostly unchanged year to year, lessons stayed relevant. You weren't constantly relearning how to live. You were refining how to live better within the same frame. That stability allowed culture to form. Songs timed to work rhythms. Stories shaped around the fire's glow. Superstitions attached to doors, beams, thresholds. These weren't random beliefs. They were mnemonic devices, ways to remember what mattered. Don't block the hearth. Don't waste daylight. Don't leave openings unattended. Wrapped in story, these rules stuck. The house didn't just shelter bodies. It sheltered memory. Memory mattered because it reduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is exhausting. When the future is unknowable, energy drains faster. When the future is constrained but familiar, endurance increases. Winter was constrained by the house. Its effects were filtered, delayed, softened. That softening didn't eliminate hardship, but it gave people time to respond. Time is the most valuable resource in survival. A thick wall buys time. A slow-burning log buys time. A predictable routine buys time. Time allows adjustment. Adjustment allows survival. This is why medieval houses often look crude to modern eyes. They were not designed to impress. They were designed to buy time. Time to notice illness. Time to ration food. Time to rest. Time to help each other. Speed was dangerous. Slow systems fail gracefully. Modern life prizes speed and efficiency, often at the cost of graceful failure. When modern systems break, they break suddenly. Medieval houses broke slowly. Cracks appeared. Drafts grew. Signs accumulated. Those signs were readable. Reading them became second nature. You didn't need to check instruments. Your body told you. Cold feet. Heavy air. Weak flames. These were signals, not annoyances. The house trained people to interpret signals instead of ignoring them. That skill extended beyond winter. It shaped farming, health, relationships. Small problems were addressed early because ignoring them was not an option. Deferred maintenance wasn't a concept, it was a risk. This constant, low-level responsiveness created resilience without drama. No one talked about it. No one named it. It simply existed. Resilience didn't look like toughness. It looked like flexibility within limits. When storms trapped people inside for days, routines compressed. Work slowed. Conversation filled space. Silence was allowed. The house absorbed tension the way walls absorb sound, never completely, but enough. Enough is the key word. Medieval life rarely aimed for optimal. It aimed for enough. Enough warmth. Enough food. Enough rest. Enough cooperation. Enough to reach spring. Enough is attainable. Optimal often isn't. That mindset prevented despair. Despair thrives on unreachable standards. When survival is the standard, success is frequent. People survived most winters. That fact alone shaped outlook. Hope wasn't fragile because it wasn't inflated. It rested on precedent. We made it last year. The house stood as evidence of that statement, even ruins tell this story. Thick foundations remain long after roofs collapse. Hearts outlast walls. Stone endures. These remnants whisper the same logic: build for endurance, not display. The medieval peasant house was not a backdrop to life. It was an active participant. It shaped behavior, expectations, emotions, and memory. It taught people how to live with limits without being crushed by them. And that lesson is timeless. Not because we should return to smoky rooms and dirt floors, but because the principle still applies. Design systems, homes, routines, societies, that assume strain. That slow failure. That reward patience. That make hardship smaller. Winter will always come in some form. The question is not whether it arrives, but whether what we build can absorb it. For centuries, these houses did. Quietly. Repeatedly. Without applause. And that, more than anything else, is why they mattered, and absorbing strain didn't mean eliminating feeling. People still felt fear, hunger, frustration, grief. The difference was that those feelings had somewhere to go. The house held them the way it held heat, imperfectly, but reliably enough to prevent collapse. Emotions, like warmth, dissipate quickly when spread too thin. Medieval winter life concentrated both. You didn't disperse yourself across endless spaces or obligations. You were here. Now. With these people. In this room. That concentration gave feelings shape instead of letting them spiral. Anger cooled faster when there was nowhere for it to echo. Sadness softened when it was shared in silence rather than isolated in private rooms. Even joy felt different, quieter, steadier, less performative. Laughter stayed low, close to the fire, not broadcast outward. The house encouraged emotional moderation simply by limiting amplification. Amplification is what exhausts people. Constant peaks and crashes. Too much stimulation followed by too little recovery. Medieval winter offered neither extreme. Days were muted. Nights were long. Life moved in a narrow band of intensity. That narrow band was survivable. The body adapted to it. Metabolism slowed. Movements became economical. Speech thinned to what mattered. You didn't waste breath explaining what everyone already understood. Understanding was shared, not negotiated endlessly. This reduced cognitive load in a way that's hard to appreciate from the outside. Modern life asks us to decide constantly, what to do, where to go, how to respond. Medieval winter removed many of those decisions by necessity. There was less freedom, but also less mental fatigue. The house decided for you in many cases. It was dark, so you rested. It was cold, so you stayed close. Fuel was limited, so you conserved. When decisions are obvious, energy is saved. Saved energy became resilience. It allowed people to endure weeks that might otherwise have broken them. It allowed illness to pass without panic. It allowed loss to be absorbed without immediate unraveling. Grief moved slowly in winter. There was time for it. The house did not demand productivity from the grieving. It did not ask for performance. It simply continued to stand, to hold heat, to shelter bodies that needed stillness. Stillness is underrated as a survival tool. Stillness allows recalibration. It lets systems settle. It prevents cascading failure. Medieval houses enforced stillness by making activity costly. Every movement required warmth. Every task required light. Every choice had consequences. So people chose carefully. Carefulness became culture. That culture extended beyond winter, but winter sharpened it. The season acted like a stress test, revealing what worked and what didn't. Anything unnecessary was stripped away year after year. What remained was not elegant, but it was functional. Functionality built trust. You trusted the roof because it had held before. You trusted the hearth because it had warmed you through worse nights. You trusted the walls because they had endured storms you remembered as children. Trust reduces fear. Fear drains energy. When fear is low, cooperation increases. People help each other not because they are virtuous, but because it makes sense. A helping hand now means a helping hand later. The house makes this logic obvious by forcing proximity. Proximity turns abstract consequences into immediate ones. You see the person you depend on. You feel their absence. You notice their weakness. Care becomes practical rather than sentimental. This practicality kept communities intact through winters that might otherwise have fractured them. Not perfectly. Not always. But often enough to matter. The house was central to that outcome. It was the stage on which winter life played out, but also the scriptwriter that constrained the plot. It limited how bad things could get, how fast they could unravel. Limitation is a form of mercy. Mercy doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like the absence of disaster. It feels like another morning where the fire still burns. Another night where the wind stays outside. Another week endured. Endurance accumulates quietly. By spring, people were changed. Thinner. Older. Sometimes quieter. But also seasoned. They had lived through constraint and learned its contours. They knew where the limits were, and that knowledge was power. Not power over nature. Power within it. The house embodied that internal power. It didn't move mountains. It didn't banish cold. It simply reduced exposure, delayed damage, and bought time. Time to adapt. Time to recover. Time to continue. This is why these houses lasted as long as they did, not just physically, but culturally. They were copied, repaired, imitated, and passed down because they worked. Not in theory. In lived reality. They were shaped by failure more than success. Every thickened wall was a response to cold. Every lowered ceiling was a response to heat loss. Every compact room was a response to scarcity. Failure refined them. Refinement through failure produces humility. Humility produces resilience. The medieval peasant house was a humble object. But humility is not weakness. It is alignment with reality. And alignment is stronger than defiance. So when winter returned, as it always did, it found fewer angles of attack. Fewer surprises. Fewer vulnerabilities. Not because winter was weaker, but because life had been arranged to meet it calmly. That calm was not optimism. It was familiarity. We know this season. And familiarity is one of the strongest defenses humans have. Not because it removes danger, but because it removes panic. Panic wastes energy. Panic creates mistakes. Panic convinces people that the present moment is unprecedented when, in fact, it has happened before and was survived. The medieval house was a physical memory of survival. Its beams remembered winters people had forgotten. Its walls carried the imprint of storms that no longer had names. Every patch and reinforcement was evidence that something had gone wrong once, and had been corrected quietly afterward. That history lived in the structure itself. You didn't need to tell stories about resilience. You lived inside it. This changed how people perceived time. Winter wasn't a singular catastrophe looming in the future. It was a recurring phase with known parameters. You prepared, you endured, you emerged. The house made that cycle tangible. Cycles are easier to bear than chaos. Modern life often feels chaotic because systems are invisible until they fail. Medieval systems were always visible. You saw the fire consuming fuel. You felt the draft when a seal weakened. You noticed the roof sag before it collapsed. Feedback was immediate. Immediate feedback encourages responsibility. If you ignored a problem, you suffered quickly. If you addressed it, relief followed. Cause and effect were not separated by layers of abstraction. The house taught this lesson daily. Children grew up understanding systems intuitively. They learned where heat came from, where it escaped, how effort translated into comfort. They didn't memorize these ideas. They absorbed them through lived experience. This produced a different relationship with labor. Work wasn't framed as punishment or virtue. It was framed as maintenance. You worked to keep things from getting worse. Improvement was secondary. Maintenance is quiet work. It doesn't generate applause. It rarely creates visible transformation. But it prevents decay. And prevention is more efficient than repair. The medieval house centered life around prevention. Leaks were stopped early. Drafts were sealed quickly. Fires were tended constantly. Food was preserved long before hunger arrived. Nothing waited for crisis if it could be addressed beforehand. This mindset reduced drama. There were still hardships, but fewer sudden collapses. Life bent under pressure instead of snapping. Bending requires flexibility. The house provided that by being adaptable rather than rigid. Walls could be thickened. Roofs could be reinforced. Spaces could be reconfigured. Nothing was locked into a single, fragile design. Rigid systems fail spectacularly. Flexible ones fail slowly, giving people time to respond. Time, again, was the true resource being protected. Time to notice. Time to adjust. Time to survive one more night. The house didn't promise comfort. It promised time. Over generations, this promise shaped values. Excess was viewed with suspicion. Not for moral reasons, but practical ones. Excess created exposure. Large windows leaked heat. Tall walls caught wind. Decorative features introduced weak points. Beauty was allowed, but only when it didn't compromise function. This created an aesthetic of restraint. Things were beautiful because they worked well, not because they impressed from a distance. Beauty was felt more than seen. From the outside, medieval homes looked crude. From the inside, they felt coherent. Everything belonged. Nothing felt accidental. Coherence reduces stress. When objects and spaces make sense together, the mind rests more easily. Confusion is tiring. Order, even simple order, is calming. Winter already exhausted people physically. The house reduced mental exhaustion wherever it could. Light was dim, but predictable. Sounds were muffled, but familiar. Smells were strong, but constant. Consistency replaced variety. Variety is stimulating. Stimulation is costly. The medieval house spent resources sparingly. It conserved not just heat, but attention, emotion, and effort. It created an environment where nothing demanded excess. This doesn't mean life was dull. It means life was focused. Focus is survival under constraint. When spring finally arrived, it felt dramatic not because people were desperate, but because contrast returned. Light increased. Space expanded outward. Activities moved outside. The house loosened its grip. But it was always there in the background, ready to tighten again when needed. That reliability created confidence. You could venture out knowing there was a stable center to return to. Exploration is safer when retreat is guaranteed. The house was that guarantee. Even when people traveled, traded, or raided, the memory of home anchored them. Not emotionally in a sentimental way, but practically. They knew what kind of shelter worked. They knew what standards mattered. Those standards traveled with them. This is how building traditions spread, not through theory, but through demonstrated success. You copy what survives. And what survived was not the most ambitious design, but the most forgiving one. Forgiveness in architecture means allowing mistakes without catastrophic consequences. It means tolerating misuse, neglect, and imperfect repairs. Medieval houses were forgiving. Modern systems often are not. That difference explains why ancient structures can feel strangely calming despite their hardship. They were built to accommodate human limits rather than deny them. Humans get tired. Humans forget. Humans make errors. The house expected this. It didn't assume constant vigilance or perfect execution. It assumed fatigue and compensated for it. That assumption is deeply humane. So when we talk about medieval winter survival, we're not really talking about toughness. We're talking about design that acknowledged weakness without shame. The people weren't stronger. The systems were kinder. Kinder systems don't eliminate struggle. They make it survivable. And in a world where winter lasted months and mistakes were costly, survivable was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And survivable is a strange word, because it sounds minimal, almost defeatist. But in environments like medieval winters, survivable is ambitious. It means life continues. It means stories don't end early. It means children grow up and elders grow old. It means memory has time to accumulate. Memory changes behavior. People who survive the same hardship repeatedly stop treating it like an emergency and start treating it like weather. Dangerous weather, yes, but predictable. Predictability shrinks fear. Fear is what exhausts societies faster than cold ever could. The house was the device that converted danger into predictability. Because once danger is predictable, it becomes manageable. You can plan around it. You can pace yourself. You can conserve energy instead of burning it all at once in panic. That pacing mattered. Medieval winters were long. Not dramatic for a week or two, but grinding for months. Any solution that worked only briefly was useless. Firewood ran out. Bodies weakened. Attention drifted. The house was designed for duration. Nothing inside it demanded constant peak performance. Fires were steady, not roaring. Repairs were small and frequent, not catastrophic. Routines were repetitive, not stimulating. This allowed endurance without burnout. Burnout is not a modern invention. It just has a modern name. In medieval winters, burnout looked like carelessness. Forgetting to bank the fire. Ignoring a small leak. Skipping maintenance because you were tired. These mistakes were dangerous, but the house softened their impact. A missed task didn't instantly doom the household. The walls bought time. The insulation slowed damage. The structure absorbed neglect the way a forest absorbs wind. Absorption is the quiet opposite of resistance. Resistant systems snap when overwhelmed. Absorptive systems bend, dulling impact. Medieval houses absorbed winter rather than fighting it head-on. That absorption extended to social strain as well. Crowded spaces inevitably created tension. People argued. Tempers flared. Privacy was limited. But because separation was difficult, reconciliation was unavoidable. You couldn't storm off into another room for days. You cooled down because the environment required it. The house enforced emotional closure. Unresolved conflict wastes energy. It disrupts cooperation. Medieval homes constrained that waste by forcing proximity until tensions burned out like embers. This didn't create harmony. It created functionality. Functionality is underrated in discussions of happiness. But happiness without functionality collapses quickly under pressure. Medieval life prioritized the reverse. The result was not joy in the modern sense, but steadiness. A baseline of good enough that rarely collapsed completely. Good enough is powerful. It allows for bad days without turning them into catastrophes. It allows grief without unraveling the household. It allows weakness without immediate punishment. The house normalized weakness by planning for it. When someone fell ill, the environment already assumed reduced capacity. Work slowed. Others compensated. The system flexed. This flexibility was not charity. It was insurance. Anyone could be next. Winter reminded people of that constantly. You didn't moralize weakness when survival depended on collective endurance. The house made that dependence unavoidable. Even architecture taught empathy. When you feel drafts together, you fix them together. When warmth is shared, hoarding makes no sense. When space is limited, cooperation becomes the default. The house didn't preach values. It made alternatives impractical. Over time, this shaped worldview. Life was understood as interdependent rather than individualistic. Not philosophically, but physically. You could not pretend independence while sharing heat, fire, air, and shelter. This realism grounded expectations. People did not expect endless comfort. They expected effort followed by rest. They expected hardship followed by relief. Extremes were temporary. That expectation stabilized emotions. Modern anxiety often comes from mismatch between expectation and reality. Medieval expectation matched reality closely. Life was hard. Winter was worse. The house made it tolerable, not magical. That honesty reduced disappointment. Disappointment is corrosive. It breeds resentment. Resentment fractures communities. The house quietly prevented that by never promising more than it could deliver. It didn't promise warmth everywhere. Just enough where it mattered. It didn't promise light. Just enough to function. It didn't promise silence. Just enough to sleep. Enough, again, was the standard. And because the standard was clear, people could meet it. Meeting standards builds confidence. Confidence builds resilience. By the end of winter, survival wasn't seen as luck. It was seen as competence. The house had done its job. The people had done theirs. This competence fed into identity. Not heroic identity, but capable identity. We know how to live here. That knowledge was passed down not through instruction manuals, but through structures that embodied it. Children learned by inhabiting wisdom. They didn't need to be told why walls were thick or roofs were low. They felt the difference when storms came. Understanding was experiential. Experiential knowledge is harder to erase. Even when conditions improved, even when new materials appeared, the old logic lingered. It stayed because it had been tested under the worst circumstances. And that is why these houses matter beyond history. They are reminders that survival is often less about strength and more about arrangement. Less about fighting and more about positioning. Position yourself so harm has to work harder. That was the medieval strategy. And it worked, not because people were tougher, but because their environments were honest. Honest about limits. Honest about needs. Honest about winter. And in that honesty, life found a way to continue, and continuation, more than innovation, is what kept everything alive. Medieval survival wasn't built on sudden breakthroughs. It was built on not breaking what already worked. When something endured one winter, it earned the right to face the next. That mindset shaped patience. Patience wasn't a virtue people talked about. It was a requirement imposed by reality. You couldn't rush warmth. You couldn't rush daylight. You couldn't rush spring. The house enforced waiting as a skill. Waiting, when structured, becomes tolerable. Unstructured waiting becomes despair. The house structured waiting. There were rhythms to the day that repeated regardless of mood. Fires were checked. Food was prepared. Tools were mended. Animals were fed. Ash was cleared. Snow was managed. These actions anchored time. When days blur together, routine creates markers. You know where you are in the day because the house tells you. You know where you are in the season because the cold behaves in familiar ways. This prevented temporal disorientation. People didn't feel endlessly trapped in now. They felt inside a cycle moving, slowly, toward change. Movement doesn't have to be fast to be real. The slow return of light mattered enormously. Even before warmth returned, brightness increased. The house responded subtly. Smoke lifted differently. Shadows shifted. The interior felt less compressed. These changes were noticed precisely because everything else stayed constant. Constancy sharpened perception. In modern life, constant change dulls awareness. In medieval winter, sameness made small differences meaningful. A slightly warmer morning. A longer twilight. A patch of thaw near the door. Hope arrived in increments small enough to trust. The house made room for that hope by not collapsing beforehand. That might sound obvious, but collapse is common when systems are overstressed. The medieval house avoided overstress by being conservative. It didn't chase efficiency to the point of fragility. It accepted inefficiency when it increased reliability. Thick walls are inefficient in material use. Turf roofs are heavy. Low ceilings limit movement. Smoke-filled interiors are unpleasant. But each inefficiency added margin. Margin is what keeps systems alive when conditions exceed expectations. Medieval winters often exceeded expectations. The house assumed that. It was built with slack. Slack in walls. Slack in heat retention. Slack in space allocation. That slack absorbed surprises. Surprises are dangerous when there's no buffer. Modern systems often optimize away buffers in the name of progress. Medieval systems kept buffers because experience taught them that winter does not care about optimization. Winter tests margins. So did disease, famine, and conflict. The house couldn't stop these, but it reduced compounding failure. When external pressures stacked up, the shelter remained stable. Stability is not the absence of stress. It is the ability to hold stress without disintegrating. The medieval house held stress physically and socially. When food was scarce, people ate closer together. When illness spread, care happened inside. When storms trapped people for days, the house expanded inward rather than forcing outward action. This inward expansion is counterintuitive. Modern responses to stress often involve seeking escape. Medieval responses involve deepening containment. Containment is not confinement when it's chosen by necessity. The house made that choice for people so they didn't have to argue about it. It removed options that would have led to harm. You couldn't wander far in a blizzard. You couldn't isolate without losing heat. You couldn't ignore others without consequences. The environment enforced cooperation without moralizing it. That enforcement reduced decision fatigue. People didn't debate survival strategies endlessly. The strategy was built into the walls. This freed mental space for endurance rather than analysis. Analysis under extreme conditions often leads to paralysis. Medieval design minimized the need for it. Over time, this produced a kind of quiet confidence. Not the confidence of mastery, but the confidence of familiarity. You knew what winter would ask of you, and you knew you could meet those demands again. That knowledge softened fear of the future. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Medieval winters were harsh but certain. The house translated certainty into shelter. Even stories reflected this. Tales told by the hearth often circled familiar themes: loss, endurance, return. They weren't meant to surprise. They were meant to remind. Remind people that hardship passes. That others before them endured. That the structure around them was part of that lineage. Lineage matters in survival contexts. When you see that something has worked for generations, you trust it more than something new. Trust reduces anxiety. Anxiety drains energy. The medieval house was trustworthy. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. About what it could and could not do. It could not make winter pleasant. It could not eliminate hunger. It could not prevent death. But it could make survival likely. Likelihood is enough when repeated over centuries. That repetition created continuity. Villages persisted in the same locations despite brutal climates because the built environment adapted to those climates instead of resisting them. Resistance is exhausting. Adaptation is sustainable. The house adapted by blending into the landscape. Turf roofs blurred the line between shelter and ground. Sunken floors merged building with earth. From a distance, homes looked like part of the terrain. This reduced wind exposure. It also reduced psychological exposure. When your home looks like it belongs, you feel less like an intruder in a hostile world. Belonging matters under stress. The medieval house told its occupants, "You fit here, even in winter." That message is powerful. Feeling out of place amplifies hardship. Feeling grounded reduces it. The house grounded people physically and mentally. And grounding allowed people to invest emotionally in the future. To plan beyond survival. To raise children. To maintain traditions. Winter didn't end life. It framed it. The house was the frame. Without it, winter would have dominated everything. With it, winter became a chapter, not the whole story. And that distinction, between chapter and story, is what kept societies alive long enough to change, evolve, and eventually leave these houses behind. Not because the houses failed, but because they succeeded long enough to make progress possible. They bought time. And time, more than warmth or light or comfort, is the rarest resource in harsh environments. The medieval house understood that. It still does, and time, once bought, was spent carefully. Every action inside the house carried weight. Nothing was wasted because waste cost energy, and energy was currency during a winter that would not relent. Every step, every gesture, every breath contributed to endurance. Even small inefficiencies mattered, and the house, by its very design, nudged people toward efficiency without forcing rigidity. Efficiency in this context was subtle. Not about speed. Not about productivity in the modern sense. It was about conservation. Conserving heat, conserving fuel, conserving physical strength, conserving social harmony. The medieval house was a system that aligned human behavior with survival imperatives. Lighting was an example of this. Windows were small to keep heat in, but positioned to catch what light existed. Candles were scarce and rationed, placed only where necessary. Shadows were long and constant, but familiar. People learned to navigate rooms by memory, moving in practice patterns that minimized exposure to drafts and cold surfaces. The house itself trained its occupants, making them sensitive to the smallest environmental cues. Storage was another silent teacher. Food, tools, clothing, everything had a place near enough for access but out of harm's way from rodents or damp. There was a rhythm to rotation. Preserved meat was consumed first, grains stored deeper, furs aired to prevent mold. These routines were reinforced not by manuals but by observation and consequence. Neglect led to spoilage. Attention led to survival. This reinforcement extended to interpersonal dynamics. Crowded spaces meant that cooperation wasn't optional. Heat shared among humans amplified comfort. Work shared among humans amplified efficiency. The house made conflict possible but costly, and collaboration advantageous. Proximity sharpened social awareness, teaching negotiation, patience, and compromise. Survival depended on social intelligence as much as physical skill. Children absorbed this implicitly. Their play mimicked adult work. They learned where to move, what to touch, how to carry small burdens, and how to read the state of the fire or the air. Play was practice. Daily routines were practice. Life was constant, low-stakes training for real-world survival. Even sleep was structured. Raised platforms protected bodies from cold floors. Shared bedding conserved warmth. Proximity reduced drafts. Sleep patterns adjusted to light cycles, not whims. Rest was neither indulgence nor punishment, it was strategy. Sleep restored energy in measurable ways, preparing bodies for the next round of endurance. The hearth remained central, both physically and symbolically. It was more than a source of heat, it was the anchor for all domestic activity. Cooking, tool repair, socialization, hygiene, it all revolved around the fire. Its steady glow provided spatial and temporal orientation. Its predictable warmth anchored routines and, indirectly, emotional regulation. The hearth transformed space into a coherent system, allowing humans to function effectively despite external chaos. Smoke, as inconvenient as it was, played multiple roles. It preserved materials, deterred pests, sealed gaps, and even shaped breathing patterns. People learned to accommodate it, positioning themselves where it was least intrusive yet most effective. Adaptation to imperfection became a form of mastery. Survival wasn't about eliminating difficulty, it was about dancing with it, learning its rhythms, and avoiding its worst consequences. Over months, the cumulative effect of these design principles was profound. Physical survival merged seamlessly with mental resilience. The house, walls, fire, and turf collectively reduced entropy. Life inside didn't feel heroic, but it functioned reliably. And that reliability became the foundation for culture. Songs were sung, stories told, crafts perfected, children educated, all while winter raged outside. Even minor architectural choices were informed by accumulated experience. Roof angles managed snow load. Turf thickness insulated against extreme cold. Sunken floors stabilized temperature. Window size balanced light and draft. Each decision reflected centuries of trial, error, and incremental learning. Knowledge was encoded in structure, not just memory. The house itself was a repository of survival wisdom, and in that wisdom lay a subtle elegance. Modern observers might dismiss these homes as crude, low, dark, smoky, and uneven. But every imperfection had a purpose. Crudeness became robustness. Darkness became thermal efficiency. Smoke became multifunctional utility. Uneven walls absorbed pressure and heat. The medieval house turned adversity into a design principle. By the end of winter, the people inside emerged altered. They were thinner, more disciplined, more attentive, and socially attuned. They were alive not because they had defied nature, but because they had aligned themselves with it through deliberate, patient, and careful habitation. Life continued not as a battle, but as a measured negotiation with the environment. The house itself, often overlooked in history, was the silent hero of this survival. Its lessons extended beyond winter, they shaped social norms, behavioral patterns, cultural memory, and even values of restraint, patience, and foresight. In a way, the medieval house taught humanity how to live with limits without being crushed by them. Winter passed. Snow melted. The wind softened. Light returned. And yet, the wisdom embedded in those walls, floors, and roofs endured, shaping the next winter long before it arrived. The house had not only preserved life, it had transmitted knowledge, endurance, and perspective, lessons that were both practical and profoundly human, and when spring finally came, it was not a sudden explosion of life, but a gradual relief, measured and quiet. The snow melted slowly, revealing the contours of the turf roofs, the sunken floors, the walls still thick with accumulated earth and moss. The house, like its occupants, had endured. It bore the marks of winter, the patched walls, the repaired hearth, the soot-stained beams, but it had survived intact, a testament to patience and careful planning. Spring was a time of assessment. People inspected walls for cracks, floors for drainage issues, roofs for sagging turf. Repairs were undertaken methodically, not rushed. Tools were sharpened, timber beams reinforced, turf blocks replaced or adjusted. The house demanded attention, but not panic. Every action reinforced the relationship between effort and survival. This cyclical rhythm, prepare, endure, repair, and survive, became ingrained over generations. Children growing up inside these homes internalized the patterns. They learned not through abstract lessons but by observation and participation. They knew the weight of a turf block, the smell of a healthy hearth, the subtle draft that meant a wall needed attention. They learned the cost of negligence and the rewards of foresight. Even social life was shaped by these rhythms. Meals were shared strategically around the hearth, with the warmth concentrated where it mattered. Work was distributed according to strength and skill, with the physically weaker performing tasks that required less exertion but were equally critical to survival. The presence of livestock indoors not only conserved heat but also reinforced the human-animal connection, creating an ecosystem of shared survival. These living arrangements reinforced empathy, cooperation, and community memory. Conflict was managed pragmatically, proximity forced negotiation, compromise, and reconciliation. Every interaction was filtered through the lens of survival. Emotional energy was preserved for essential tasks, not wasted on petty disputes. In this way, the house didn't just shelter the body, it guided the mind. Even illness was moderated by architecture. Smoke slowly purified air, reducing parasite populations. Thick walls moderated humidity and temperature, slowing the spread of disease. The house itself acted as a buffer against biological threats, giving families time to care for the sick without immediate collapse. The spatial arrangement, separate platforms, partitions, and proximity, allowed for efficient care while maintaining warmth and safety. As summer approached, the long days brought opportunities for maintenance and improvement. Repairs that had been impossible in deep winter could now be conducted with ease. Timber could be dried and strengthened, turf replaced or layered, and drainage systems refined. The cycle of preparation, endurance, and repair was reinforced, creating a continuous feedback loop of improvement that increased the resilience of both house and inhabitants. The house also shaped perception of time itself. The long winters, the brief springs, and the moderate summers created a cyclical view of life. People measured existence in terms of survival cycles rather than abstract years. Daily tasks, seasonal rhythms, and environmental cues provided a tangible framework for planning and reflection. Life was understood as a series of interconnected events, each dependent on careful observation, attention, and timing. Even architecture communicated cultural memory. Every reinforced beam, every thickened wall, every carefully arranged hearth was a repository of past experience. These were not just homes, they were living lessons, passed down to future generations. The knowledge embedded in the house ensured continuity. Communities survived not by chance, but by design, by learning from every storm, every blizzard, every long night. The medieval house became a teacher of endurance, patience, cooperation, and humility. It instructed people without words, guiding them through the harshest conditions with structure, repetition, and subtle cues. Its lessons went beyond physical survival, they shaped behavior, social cohesion, emotional regulation, and long-term thinking. Even when modern conveniences arrived centuries later, the principles embedded in these homes remained valuable. Thick insulation, central heating, careful spatial arrangement, and efficient use of resources are echoes of these survival strategies. The medieval house demonstrates that resilience is not about grandeur or elegance, but about careful observation, practical design, and alignment with natural forces. Ultimately, the house and its winter-tested inhabitants exemplify a universal truth: survival is not a matter of brute strength or luck. It is a system of understanding, adaptation, and continuous care. The walls, the hearth, the turf, and the smoke were all components of this system. Together, they created a space where life could persist against relentless cold, scarcity, and uncertainty. And that is why these homes endure in memory, archaeology, and imagination. They are monuments not to human conquest, but to human patience, ingenuity, and quiet cooperation. They teach us that the measure of a house is not its beauty or its size, but its ability to hold life steady through the storm. And as the years passed, the cycle repeated itself with a rhythm as relentless as the seasons. Winter would return, early and unannounced, reminding people that comfort was a privilege earned, not a given. Yet the lessons of previous winters remained embedded in the house, in the walls, and in the routines of those who lived there. Each frost, each blizzard, each long, dark night reinforced knowledge gained the year before. Preparation became instinctual. Firewood was stacked with foresight, not haste. Grain stores were monitored, rotated, and protected from moisture and pests. Tools were sharpened and repaired not just for use, but to maintain their reliability throughout the long season. These routines were repeated year after year, creating a form of cultural memory that transcended individual lifespans. The house itself was a living ledger of survival. Children who had grown accustomed to these rhythms internalized them in ways adults often overlooked. They learned not only which spaces were warmest or safest, but how to anticipate danger and respond efficiently. They learned that inefficiency was costly, and that cooperation wasn't a moral choice but a practical necessity. Games mimicked work, chores were approached as skill-building exercises. Learning survival was immersive, comprehensive, and continuous. Social cohesion thrived under these constraints. Conflict existed, of course, but the design of the long house and the realities of winter enforced resolution. You could not afford protracted disputes when every hand mattered for survival. Crowding demanded negotiation and fostered empathy. By necessity, children observed problem-solving firsthand, adults modeled collaboration, and households learned resilience collectively. Even illness and injury were managed within this framework. Sickness could spread quickly in close quarters, yet the architecture of the house mitigated the risk. Smoke and heat discouraged parasites, insulated walls moderated temperature fluctuations, and ventilation patterns encouraged circulation while retaining warmth. Care for the ill became a household responsibility, distributed naturally among those most able to help. Survival depended on vigilance, and the house made vigilance part of daily life. Daily life was deeply intertwined with the physical environment. Every action was deliberate, tending fires, preparing meals, repairing roofs, caring for animals. Effort was concentrated on tasks that sustained life. Excessive motion, unnecessary exposure to cold, or distraction from essential work could have immediate consequences. The long house was an environment that rewarded attentiveness and punished negligence, creating a disciplined, responsive community. The cyclical nature of the seasons also shaped perception of time and progress. Life was measured not in abstract years but in survival cycles, the arrival of winter, the thaw of spring, the planting and harvest, the rotation of livestock. Activities were planned around these cycles, creating a sense of continuity and predictability. This predictability reduced anxiety, conserved energy, and allowed long-term thinking despite the harshness of the environment. Even architectural details reflected accumulated experience. Roof pitch managed snow loads, preventing structural collapse. Turf thickness insulated the interior and moderated temperature swings. Sunken floors reduced exposure to drafts and stabilized the interior climate. Window placement balanced light and heat retention. Every feature was informed by observation, trial and error, and intergenerational knowledge. The houses themselves were repositories of wisdom, encoded in bricks, beams, and earth. Through all this, the hearth remained central. It was the source of heat, a place for cooking, a hub for social interaction, and a stabilizing influence. Its fire burned continuously through winter, tended with care to ensure endurance. The hearth's warmth allowed for physical and emotional resilience, shaping spatial arrangements and daily routines. Activities radiated outward from it, creating a coherent, functional living environment. The long house taught subtle lessons about patience, foresight, and humility. It demonstrated that survival was not about heroism or strength, but about careful observation, incremental improvement, and alignment with natural forces. Its design reinforced the value of cooperation, discipline, and attentiveness. Life in these houses wasn't easy or comfortable by modern standards, but it was enduring, sustainable, and predictable. As centuries passed, these principles influenced broader Viking culture. Settlements thrived not merely because of individual skill, but because knowledge embedded in architecture and routine guided daily life. The design of the house shaped social norms, interpersonal behaviors, and even cultural memory. Children who grew up within these walls absorbed survival strategies and social wisdom unconsciously, ensuring continuity across generations. Even when technology evolved, and new building materials became available, the lessons of these medieval homes persisted. Thick walls, central hearths, low roofs, and compact spaces continued to influence settlement patterns and domestic architecture. The principle remained: design around survival, not vanity. Efficiency, reliability, and adaptability outweighed aesthetics or novelty. Ultimately, these homes were more than shelters. They were systems that mediated between human limits and environmental extremes. They conserved heat, energy, and attention. They mitigated the effects of scarcity and danger. They structured social behavior, reinforced community cohesion, and transmitted knowledge across generations. Survival was embedded in every beam, wall, and roof. The medieval longhouse stands as a testament to the power of careful design, incremental learning, and respect for natural forces. It demonstrates that endurance arises not from force, but from alignment, with environment, with community, and with reality itself. Winter arrived again. The house endured. Life inside endured. Stories continued. Children learned. Adults adapted. Survival, though never glamorous, remained constant, and as winter tightened its grip once more, the longhouse quietly asserted its dominance over chaos. Outside, snow piled against walls, winds howled across the landscape, and temperatures dropped to extremes that would have crippled any poorly constructed shelter. Inside, life continued, not comfortably, but steadily. The house had become an extension of the people within it, a system that turned raw adversity into manageable conditions. Every action was deliberate. Even walking across the floor was calculated to avoid unnecessary heat loss. Heavy furs and layered clothing were not mere decoration, they were functional, designed to retain warmth in combination with the body heat of other inhabitants.